And continuing on chapter 16, finishing up our autonomic nervous system. Now that we've covered the anatomy of where all these nerves are going and how they're getting there and their different options, so now looking at the physiology of that autonomic nervous system. So again, we already mentioned it maintains that homeostasis of involuntary actions. So there's that dual innervation. So we have both sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. And most organs are dually innervated, meaning that both are coming in. So sympathetic influences during exercise, this is again our fight or flight response, whereas parasympathetic is more rest and digest. So most of those actions then make sense. If we're fighting or flighting with sympathetic, we're increasing our heart rate, we're dilating the blood vessels to get more blood flow, dilating the air passages to get more oxygen. We need to make more glucose, increasing the body temperature, and then decreasing digestion in urine production. We don't need to be peeing on our way to fight or flight. We don't need to be digesting our food. Whereas in our resting state, this stimulates the digestion and the urinary production, lowering the heart rate, and we're constricting those air passages. So if we look here at, again, the effects of the parasympathetic and sympathetic on different effectors, and there are just multiple tables coming up here just to kind of understand what's happening to lead to those. So some of these effectors are only going to have one or the other. So for example, adipose or fat tissue only has sympathetic effects. There are no parasympathetic effects on any of the ones on this slide. So like blood or blood vessels, they are only sympathetic effects. So we get like increased coagulation, we get constriction of the heart, we also get dilation then or constriction depending on the type of receptor that's coming in there. So we can constrict it or dilate it. Again, we have multiple effects coming in. Again, if we move into the eye, now we're getting into some where we have both sympathetic and parasympathetic effects. So if we look at those receptor types, so again, if the pupil with sympathetic, we're dilating it. With parasympathetic, it's being constricted. So typically opposite effects are happening. If we look at the pancreas and insulin, so we're decreasing insulin secretion whenever the sympathetic innervation is there. With parasympathetic, we're increasing that secretion because insulin is increasing glucose being stored. So when we're fighting or flighting, we don't want to be storing glucose, we need it. So we're going to decrease insulin. When we're hanging out, resting, and digesting, we increase it, just as an example here. Again, just another example here. So again, here with metabolism, we're increasing it with the sympathetic. There's no effect of the parasympathetic. Whereas with the stomach walls, we're decreasing the tone with sympathetic, increasing in motility with parasympathetic. So again, fight or flight. We don't need to have a lot of digestion, a lot of movement through the digestive system, but as we're resting, we increase that. So typically the parasympathetic and sympathetic have opposite effects, or sometimes with some effectors, only sympathetic is causing an effect. And then just the last part here, this really long table from your text. Again, we have opposite effects happening here with the bladder. So again, contraction of the bladder with sympathetic. We don't need to be urinating during that, where we're relaxing it with parasympathetic. To our neurotransmitters, which are actually causing all these different effects. So these are the primary substances made by the neurons of the autonomic nervous system. So we already mentioned with our summary table, again, acetylcholine is released by what are called cholinergic neurons. So these are all the preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. Doesn't matter which one, all preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine by these cholinergic neurons. And then this acetylcholine by cholinergic neurons is also all the postganglionic neurons, but only of the parasympathetic. Then sympathetic postganglionic neurons are releasing acetylcholine by cholinergic receptors that innervate thermoregulatory sweat glands. So not all of them, just those involved in sweat glands. Now, norepinephrine is released by adrenergic neurons. So cholinergic release acetylcholine, so that choline kind of goes together. Adrenergic and norepinephrine not quite as easy to click those together. But again, just remembering adrenergic neurons release norepinephrine, and that's most of the sympathetic postganglionic neurons. And then other substances in those ANS neurons include nitric oxide, gastrin. We can also get substance P, dopamine, serotonin. So there are some other ones, but most of them are releasing that norepinephrine. All right, now what about the receptors that are receiving these neurotransmitters? So certain cells have receptors that combine those to create a response. So for example, cholinergic receptors bind to acetylcholine. So we have cholinergic neurons that release acetylcholine. We have cholinergic receptors that bind to acetylcholine. And there are two different forms, though, of cholinergic receptors. There's nicotinic and muscarinic, and we mentioned these earlier in that summary table. Now, nicotinic receptors are all the receptors of the postganglionic neurons, so all the skeletal muscles and adrenal glands. Muscarinic are all the receptors of the parasympathetic effectors, so what they're landing on, and of some sweat glands. Now the adrenergic receptors, again, adrenergic neurons release norepinephrine. Adrenergic receptors bind to norepinephrine and a close cousin, epinephrine. But there are two different types of adrenergic receptors. There's alpha and beta, and then they can even be further subdivided into alpha 1, beta 1, etc. And usually the alpha and beta have opposite effects. So if, say, alpha is constricting, then beta is dilating. And then we have lots of different drugs that interact with these receptors to alter that autonomic nervous system. So a couple terms here: agonist. These are drugs or molecules that bind to receptors and activate them. Antagonists, if you're antagonizing somebody, you're going against them. They also bind to receptors, but they are preventing the action. So agonists are going to mimic the neurotransmitters. Antagonists are going to block them. All right, now where are these receptors found? So the nicotinic receptors are on the cell bodies of both sympathetic and parasympathetic postganglionic neurons. So those are the ones receiving the acetylcholine from the preganglionic neurons. So again, they're binding acetylcholine to those nicotinic receptors, and that has an excitatory effect. Now, muscarinic receptors, these are located on the cells of all parasympathetic, so not sympathetic, only parasympathetic, and some sympathetic, so like sweat glands, for example. So again, these also bind acetylcholine, but to muscarinic receptors, and they can be excitatory or inhibitory depending on the specific receptor or effector. So again, just our picture here looking at these. So nicotinic receptors are preganglionic, neuron releases acetylcholine, and the nicotinic is on the postganglionic neuron. Now the muscarinic, these are found here whenever that acetylcholine is released from the postganglionic, so the second neuron, onto that effector cell. Now the adrenergic receptors, those are the ones receiving the norepinephrine. These are on most sympathetic effectors, so what they're binding to, and again, they're going to bind to that norepinephrine using those adrenergic receptors, and it can be inhibitory or excitatory. Again, it depends on the effect. So again, these adrenergic receptors are on the effector, not on the pre or postganglionic neuron. All right, so then how do we regulate the autonomic nervous system? So first of all, we have some autonomic reflexes. So these control the activity of visceral organs and glands like blood vessels through adjustments of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. These reflex activity are influenced by the hypothalamus that has a lot of hormones being released, and also the higher brain centers but it's the hypothalamus that overall controls that ANS. Now, the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions influence the activities of the enteric nervous system using those autonomic reflexes. So these involve the CNS, but the enteric nervous system can function independently of the central nervous system using these reflexes. So, for example, the walls of the digestive tract is stretched. Those sensory neurons send information to the enteric plexus, and then motor responses are sent to the smooth muscle of the gut, and the muscle contracts. So it doesn't have to go all the way to the brain. Right, and this is just showing those. So again, the parasympathetic here in A, that reflex goes via the vagus to lower the heart rate. An example of the sympathetic reflex of what's called the cardiac accelerator nerves, which is again sympathetic to increase the heart rate. So then the higher parts of the CNS, how do they influence? So besides the reflexes, so if it's coming from the brain, so the cerebrum and limbic system, so again, that's our thoughts and emotions, that influences that autonomic nervous system using that hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is that integration center. So again, regardless, it's going through the hypothalamus. So it interacts with the cerebrum, again, that limbic system, but also the brainstem and the spinal cord. And the hypothalamus also regulates our body temperature. So it's this integration, taking in all the information and regulating body temperature. And then the brainstem, this has some of the reflex centers, so like for the pupil size, tear production, salivation, heart rate. So again, some of those reflexes that don't go all the way to the CNS, they just go through the brainstem. Same with the spinal cord. So this is that reflex center for regulating different effects. So like defecation, urination, they're just going to the spinal cord, not to the brainstem. All right, now if we look at this autonomic and local reflexes here, the enteric nervous system, again, it's regulating that digestive tract. So the sensory neurons of the enteric plexus supplies the CNS with info, and then that autonomic effect responses to the smooth muscle and the glands. So they have a local reflex. And that local reflex does not involve the CNS. So this is involuntary, unconscious, stereotypical response. So like the stretching of the wall that causes contraction of the smooth muscle of the wall.